It was just another late-night ride, until my passenger vanished without ever opening the door. The night was cold and unforgiving, with rain drumming against the taxi's windshield like impatient fingers. Streetlights flickered, their dim glow barely cutting through the thick mist that curled around empty roads. Puddles formed on the cracked asphalt, reflecting the distorted glimmers of neon signs from distant closed shops. Inside the taxi, the heater struggled against the creeping chill, but the cold wasn't just from the weather. It felt deeper, unnatural, as if the darkness itself carried a presence. The driver, weary from hours of work, gripped the steering wheel tighter, his breath faintly fogging up the glass. The city was asleep, but something else was awake. The taxi driver rubbed his tired eyes, the glow of the dashboard clock reminding him how late it was. Another long night. His back ached from hours behind the wheel, and his fingers were stiff from gripping the steering wheel. He wanted nothing more than to go home, sink into his bed, and forget about the empty streets and eerie silence of the late hours. But his wallet was lighter than he liked, and a few more rides meant a little extra cash to get through the week. With a deep sigh, he straightened up, scanning the deserted road ahead. Just a few more fares, he told himself. Then he could finally call it a night. The city lay in an unnatural silence, the usual hum of traffic and distant chatter replaced by an eerie stillness. Flickering streetlights cast uneasy shadows, their dim glow stretching and shifting across the wet pavement. Every so often, a stray gust of wind sent a discarded newspaper skidding across the road, the only movement in an otherwise lifeless night. The taxi driver adjusted his rearview mirror, an unsettling feeling creeping over him, as if he wasn't as alone as the empty streets suggested. This was just another shift, just another ride, or so he thought. Watch the video till the end to uncover the chilling truth. Subscribe to Veils of Night for more terrifying stories. As the taxi rolled down the desolate street, the driver's eyes caught a lone figure standing near an old, dimly lit bus stop. The flickering light above cast erratic shadows, making the figure appear to shift and waver. Dressed in dark, weathered clothing, the person stood unnaturally still, their face obscured by the hood of a long coat. No movement, no shuffling of feet, just waiting. A strange unease settled over the driver, but fares were scarce this late at night. With a hesitant sigh, he slowed the car and pulled up to the curb, rolling down the window. "Need a ride?" he asked, but the moment the words left his mouth, he regretted them. The figure stood motionless, wrapped in dark, heavy clothing that seemed to absorb the dim light around them. Their posture was stiff, almost unnatural, as if they had been standing there for far too long. The hood of their coat was pulled low over their face, casting deep shadows that completely obscured their features. The driver squinted, trying to make out any details, a glimpse of skin, the shape of a nose, a flicker of eyes, but there was nothing, just darkness. A strange chill crept up his spine, but he brushed it off. It was late, and exhaustion was playing tricks on his mind. He unlocked the door, signaling the stranger to get in, unaware that this would be the ride he'd never forget. For a brief moment, the driver hesitated. Something felt off. The way the figure stood so still, the way their face remained hidden, it sent a quiet warning through his tired mind. But it was late, and fares were hard to come by. With a sigh, he reached for the door lock and clicked it open. The passenger slid into the back seat without a sound, their movements eerily smooth. No wet footprints from the rain, no rustling of fabric, just silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, they murmured an address. The driver frowned. The name didn't ring a bell. He had driven these streets for years, knew every corner, every alley, yet he had never heard of that place before. He glanced at the rearview mirror, but the passenger's face remained hidden in the shadows. A strange unease crept into his chest, but he forced a nod and shifted the car into drive. Just another ride, he told himself. Just another fare. But deep down, he already knew this was anything but normal. As the passenger entered, the driver expected the familiar thud of the door shutting, but there was nothing. No click of the latch, no shift in the car's weight. It was as if the door had never opened at all. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he glanced at the floor. The rain outside had soaked the streets, and every passenger before had left behind damp footprints and the faint scent of wet clothes. But this one? Nothing. The back seat remained completely dry, untouched. A cold prickle ran down his spine. He told himself he was imagining things, that maybe he was just too tired to notice. But deep inside, something whispered, "This isn't right." The taxi moved through the empty streets, its tires splashing against rain-soaked pavement. At first, the heater had been doing its job, keeping the cabin warm against the chill of the night. But as they drove further, the driver felt it, a sudden drop in temperature. The air inside the car turned sharp and biting, sending an unnatural cold creeping up his arms. He glanced at the dashboard. The heater was still on, yet his breath had begun to fog up in front of him. Shivering, he adjusted the vents, trying to push out more warm air. But the chill wasn't just cold. It felt wrong, like the kind that settles into old, forgotten places. Like a presence. His hands tightened on the wheel. This ride was getting stranger by the minute. The driver's fingers drummed against the steering wheel as unease settled deep in his chest. Instinctively, he glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting to catch a glimpse of his passenger. But what he saw, or rather what he didn't see, made his stomach twist. The reflection was blurred, distorted, like a smudged photograph. He blinked, adjusting the mirror slightly, but it made no difference. The shadows seemed to cling to the passenger, keeping their face hidden no matter how he looked. Streetlights passed, briefly illuminating the back seat, yet their features remained obscured, as if the light itself refused to touch them. A chill crawled up his spine. This wasn't normal. Something about this person, if they were even a person at all, was terribly, terribly wrong. The eerie silence in the taxi had stretched too long, pressing down on the driver like a heavy weight. Clearing his throat, he decided to break it. "Late night, huh?" he asked, keeping his tone light. "You heading home?" For a few seconds there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the engine and the rhythmic patter of rain against the windows. Then at last the passenger spoke. "Just drive." The voice was wrong, distant, hollow, like it was coming from somewhere far away, not from the back seat. The words seemed to echo, stretching unnaturally in the confined space of the car. Before the driver could respond, the radio crackled to life, the soft hum of music suddenly replaced by harsh, grating static. At the same time, the GPS screen flickered, its map twisting and glitching before freezing entirely. The driver's grip on the wheel tightened. This wasn't exhaustion. This wasn't his mind playing tricks. Something was deeply, terribly wrong. The road stretched ahead, empty and lifeless, swallowed by darkness. The city lights had long faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by an unsettling void. Not a single other car in sight. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of the wipers struggling against the drizzle, yet even that felt too loud in the eerie silence. The driver's unease deepened as he noticed the streetlights ahead. Every single one was broken. Their poles stood like dark, skeletal figures, casting no light, offering no guidance. The headlights of the taxi barely cut through the thick fog creeping along the cracked pavement. Why would anyone want to be dropped off here? His fingers tightened on the wheel. He swallowed the lump in his throat, resisting the urge to turn around. Just drop the passenger off and leave. That was the plan. But something inside him whispered, "You shouldn't have come this way." With a relieved sigh, the driver eased the car to a stop. Finally, the ride was over. Keeping his eyes on the road, he reached for the meter. "All right, that'll be," he started, turning around to face his passenger. But the back seat was empty. His breath caught in his throat. The door hadn't opened. There was no sound of movement, no trace of someone leaving. Yet the seat was vacant. His heart pounded as his gaze dropped lower. The seatbelt was still buckled, fastened tightly, as if someone were still sitting there. But there was no one. No damp footprints, no lingering presence. Just an open, empty void where his passenger had been. A cold dread settled over him. He had been driving with no one in the back seat. Panic surged through the driver's veins as he slammed his foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the wet pavement, the car lurching forward as he raced back toward the city. His hands trembled on the wheel, knuckles white with fear. This wasn't possible. It didn't make sense. He had seen the passenger enter, had heard their voice, had driven them here. Hadn't he? The road blurred past him, the headlights barely piercing the thick fog. He flicked frantic glances at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadowy figure back in the seat, grinning at him. But there was nothing, just the cold, empty silence pressing in around him. His breath came in ragged gasps as the distant glow of the city finally appeared on the horizon. Safety, normalcy, reality. He gripped the wheel tighter, his only thought, get away before it comes back. Still shaken, the driver pulled into a dimly lit gas station at the city's edge. The flickering neon sign buzzed overhead, casting an eerie glow on the rain-slicked pavement. He killed the engine and sat there for a moment, trying to catch his breath. His hands still trembled as he stepped out, the cool night air doing little to calm the icy dread curling in his chest. Near the entrance, an old gas station attendant leaned against the counter, lazily flipping through a newspaper. His face was weathered, his eyes dull, until the driver approached. "Hey, do you know this place?" the driver asked, his voice hoarse as he repeated the address the passenger had whispered earlier. The old man froze. Slowly, he lowered the newspaper and gave the driver a long, unreadable look. "That place?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Son, that place burned down nearly 30 years ago. No one's lived there since." The old man's face drained of color, his weathered hands gripping the counter as if steadying himself. His dull, tired eyes suddenly sharpened, filled with something the driver couldn't quite place, fear or recognition. "That's impossible," the old man murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "That place burned down 30 years ago, and so did the man who lived there." A heavy silence settled between them. The driver's stomach twisted, his pulse hammering in his ears. No, that couldn't be right. He had just driven someone there. He had spoken to them, heard their voice. Hadn't he? But as the words sank in, a terrible realization crept over him. If that man died 30 years ago, then what had been sitting in his back seat? The driver, still trembling from the encounter, slid back into his seat and gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. As a force of habit, his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. For a heartbeat, the mirror reflected the shadowy figure of the passenger, seated calmly in the back seat, their face now visible and twisted into a chilling smile. The driver's breath hitched, and he whipped around to confront the back seat, but it was empty. A cold sweat dripped down his temple as he faced forward again, the mirror now showing only his own wide-eyed reflection. His mind raced, grappling with the impossible reality of what he'd just witnessed. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to Veils of Night for more chilling tales. And remember, stay safe out there. You never know who might be riding with you.